Hello everybody. Welcome to the first of our recorded lecture material for the Early America history class. Just a couple of sort of general explanations or descriptions here before we dive into the material. What I've done with these recordings is try to condense some of the full-size lecture material from the PowerPoints on Blackboard down into, I'm sorry if you hear my cat in the background. He's shouting and doesn't like it when I talk to people that aren't him. I may have to, from time to time, sort of pause or duck away to try to refocus him a little bit. So what I'm trying to do with these recordings is to condense the full-size PowerPoints from Blackboard down into more manageable chunks to really hit the essentials and deliver those in this format. Obviously, you're certainly still expected to familiarize yourself with the content on the full PowerPoints that are provided for you within the Blackboard system, because everything all together will be part of the exams and quizzes and assignments in the course. So don't treat this as the exclusive material that you're responsible for, but by the same token, don't just look at the full-size PowerPoints on Blackboard, because I'm going to go into more detail about some of the really crucial concepts and pieces of information and the like in this format. So take notes on it as you feel you need to. Please get in touch with me anytime you've got questions about any of that, and I will certainly do my very best to help out. So, without further ado, we'll get started with the first of these recordings. This particular section, the colonial period, we're going to break down into 3 different recordings. This first one is unfortunately probably going to be the longest of the 3, just because of the content that we need to get through and the way that everything sort of broke down in terms of what made for a sort of logical division. Excuse me. So, the American colonies are part of a larger effort during the 1500s, especially into the 1600s, by different European powers to establish a presence in the Americas, right? The initial efforts are by the Spanish and the Portuguese. This is a result of, most notably, Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World in 1492. He makes 3 additional trips. He travels here 4 times, goes all through the Caribbean, parts of Central America, may land on South America's mainland at one point. And so Spain, who Columbus sails for, manages to acquire a huge colonial empire in Central and South America. Portugal manages to squeeze themselves into Brazil and establish that as a significant possession for themselves. By the 1600s and into the 1700s, the Spanish and the Portuguese have sort of fallen by the wayside. At that point, you see the emergence of other European powers, most notably the British, the French, and the Dutch, that will begin to plant their flag in North America, mainly along the eastern seaboard and into Canada. And so this is going to be the foundation of ultimately the British colonies in North America, but also these kinds of developments, especially regarding the French, will play a role in the evolution of the American colonies, and as we will see in the next topic, actually play a significant role in leading ultimately to the American Revolution. So that's kind of the broad strokes. The initial establishment of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies was through conquest. So by defeating the Aztecs, by defeating the Incas, the Spanish established the beginning of their colonial empire. The British colonies tend not to have that same kind of foundation. Yes, there is violence between European settlers and Native Americans, but it is not the sort of end-all, be-all of the way that the process develops for those colonies in New England or in the Chesapeake. The first permanent British settlement is Jamestown, Virginia. And Jamestown is established in May of 1607. There had been other attempts by the British to establish colonial territories along the sort of Virginia coast, Virginia and Carolina and Maryland coast, but they're unsuccessful. And so Jamestown is the first one that's going to actually succeed, although it's really pretty uncertain for several years after its establishment whether Jamestown is actually going to survive. Jamestown, like a lot of the British colonies, is ultimately seen as a mercantilist venture. We'll talk about mercantilism in a little bit more detail a little later on. We'll talk about it as its own kind of standalone slide. But for now, really the important thing to keep in mind is it is somewhat in reaction to the ideas of the Spanish colonial empire, which was really based on exploitation, right? It's based on extracting as much natural wealth as possible from the territory that they control. Mercantilism is a little bit more nuanced idea that uses the colonies as a source of wealth, certainly, but in a different way. And initially, when Jamestown is settled, the thinking is, well, we'll land here, there will be gold everywhere, we'll be able to make money hand over fist just by picking up chunks of precious metals from the ground, and we will become fabulously wealthy in the same way that the Spanish became fabulously wealthy from their colonial empire. But that doesn't happen. Jamestown was originally not meant to be permanent. Originally, the idea was that the settlers would arrive, fill all of their pockets and treasure chests with gold and silver, and then they would take that back to England, and that would be that. Over time, it becomes very apparent that in order to gain any kind of wealth or strategic value from this location, they're going to have to make it a permanent settlement. It's established as a capitalist venture, so this is not something where the British government says, I'm going to send the army and the navy to Virginia and establish a colony and take control. It's not that. It is a group of investors called the Virginia Company of London that pool their money and outfit 3 ships and basically pay for this entire expedition. So they pay people to make the journey, they pay to outfit these ships, they pay the sort of essentially kind of a licensing fee to the British government for the right to do this. So they arrive in 1607, May of 1607, with 104 people. But the area that they arrive in along the Chesapeake Bay is really pretty bad. It has a pretty unpleasant climate, very hot, very humid. The soil is almost impossible to grow anything in. Disease is rampant, and diseases that the British are not familiar with for the most part. Things like malaria or yellow fever, right? Things that are not certainly common in the British Isles. And also, most of the people who are involved in these expeditions haven't had a lot of exposure to those types of diseases in other parts of the world. The water supply is not entirely reliable, and there is a Native American population that is somewhat reticent to sort of play nice. Right. Now, this is going to be a little trickier than just making it sound like, oh, well, the white Europeans and the Native Americans were constantly fighting each other. It's not that, but neither is it the case that they got along famously and everybody was happy all the time and they, you know, danced through the meadows holding hands. So originally, the thinking among the settlers was, well, when we arrive, we will negotiate with the local Indian tribes, the Powhatan, and we will trade with them for food, because A, we're not supposed to be here on a permanent basis, so we don't need to figure out a way to make this long term. And B, this was the way that other failed British colonies in the region had tried to sort of set up shop. This is going to work off and on over time. It will have periods where it will go very well, but it will certainly also have periods when the Powhatan are way more reluctant to continue this kind of a relationship. Ultimately, because of a lot of different factors, within a year, there are less than 40 people left in Jamestown. And the odds are not looking good for those 40 to survive. And so this is where things really need to have to change. Jamestown, if you can look on the map on the right, it's right along the coast of Virginia. It's on what is called the James River. Part of the difficulty that the colonists face, though, is the James River isn't actually a river. It's what's called an estuary. And this means that it is completely dependent on the tides to determine whether you've got fresh water or salt water at any point during the day. So for basically 12 hours out of the day, when the tide is coming in, it is water from the Chesapeake Bay, salt water from the Chesapeake Bay, that is coming into the James River. Instead of the river flowing out to the ocean, it is water flowing in from the ocean towards the settlement. This means that you don't have fresh water during that time. It also means that because of how low the water table is, or how high the water table is, how low the landscape is, that the water that you would be able to get from digging a well can also potentially be salt water. And this is not healthy, right? It's lethal if it's a problem for too long and in too high a dose. And so the settlers are faced with unreliable water sources and a water table that is so high that when it's not salt water, the other serious problem is that the latrines will oftentimes leach into the water supply. And so this is, as you can imagine, not just disgusting and unpleasant, but unhygienic and also potentially lethal. So the settlers are faced with problems from a lot of different directions. The guy that finally kind of gets everything on a relatively firm foundation is John Smith. Captain John Smith is a professional explorer in the early 1600s. He is a mercenary, basically a soldier for hire, right? Somebody who will be paid to help fight wars for countries that are not his own. And he's one of 7 people who were originally installed as leaders of the Jamestown expedition, what they called governors. And by 1608, he decides that he's going to, 1608, 1609, he decides that he is going to step up and take charge of the Jamestown settlement, right? And he institutes a very rigorous policy that essentially boils down to, if you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't work to expand the fortifications of the Jamestown fort, if you don't work to figure out ways to establish self-sustaining agriculture, if you don't work to establish good relations with the Powhatan, you will literally not get food that day. And he enforces this. I mean, this is actually the way that he does it. Ultimately, this tough love solution really does help to establish the colony on a little bit stronger foundation. It is unfortunate for John Smith. He suffers a pretty dangerous and pretty devastating injury as a result of an accidental explosion of gunpowder. So he's forced to return to England, and he dies a short time after that. But in the meantime, while he is in Jamestown, he does really manage to set the ship right in a lot of ways. And so by 1609, 1610, you see a change in the fortunes of Jamestown to the point where it's deemed to be a stable enough investment that the Virginia Company will send more people, they will send more supplies, and increasingly during the 16 teens, England will begin to send royal officials to sort of integrate the colony more into the operation of the British Empire as a whole. And so these royal officers will arrive and help establish that government role, and will help make it so that the British government also has a vested interest in keeping Jamestown afloat. Also in 1610, one of the most important events really of all of American history happens, and that is the arrival of a guy named John Rolfe. And John Rolfe is a planter from the Caribbean, and he arrives in Jamestown and recognizes that the climate and the soil in and around Jamestown seem to be perfect for the cultivation of tobacco. And it is not an exaggeration to say that this will totally transform Virginia's economy, and ultimately the ripple effects of the introduction of tobacco into the United States, or to the American colonies at the time. The introduction of tobacco is going to totally define virtually all of America's history long term. And that sounds like that might be a bit of hyperbole, a bit of exaggeration, but it's really, really not. It is a cash crop, which means that it's not used for food, so it's not a crop that will help Jamestown survive in terms of giving it sustenance, but it helps Jamestown survive because it gives that colony a reason for existence, right? It provides a financial reason for Jamestown to continue operating when there are no dramatic sort of wealth advantages that Jamestown can offer, right? It's not as though Jamestown is producing gold or silver or precious gems or sugar or anything like that. Tobacco is also going to be the defining feature of Virginia's society, Virginia's politics, Virginia's culture in a lot of ways. And the division, the distinctions between the way Virginia develops and the way other colonies, especially in New England, develop, will really be the starting point for tensions that will ultimately lead to the Civil War. And so it is a hugely, hugely significant event in American history. Definitely something that you will want to pay close attention to, because it's going to be the kind of thing, hint, hint, that will appear on an exam or two. This is not John Rolfe. This is Disney's version of John Rolfe. Apparently in the almost straight-to-video Disney movie Pocahontas 2, Pocahontas's Revenge, this is the way that John Rolfe is portrayed. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that even though we don't have photographs or cartoons of John Rolfe from 1610, that John Rolfe did not look like this. Honestly, in fact, probably nobody in all of human history has ever looked that handsome. Certainly nobody in 1610 was going to look like that. But in the absence of other images of John Rolfe, there you go. You can pretend and imagine that this is the John Rolfe of tobacco in Jamestown in 1610. So tobacco, in more detail, what's the deal? And why is it important? How does it fit in? So tobacco is what's known as an economy of scale. And basically all you need to know about that is an economy of scale is one that benefits from being operated in a large way, right? So in the case of a cash crop like tobacco or sugar or indigo, the more land you have under cultivation, the more profit you will make, because the less your overhead costs will be. So tobacco requires huge amounts of land, partially because tobacco as a plant is very devastating to the soil, right? Most plants, when you plant them, they will take nutrients from the soil and use that for themselves to grow. Tobacco does that, but also puts poison into the soil. So it's a really pretty awful plant to try to grow. So you need lots and lots of land, because if all you do is fill it all with tobacco all the time, you're going to poison the land off to the point where you're never going to be able to use it again. So you have to rotate the tobacco around so that you always have land that is free, maybe growing some other crop, but at the very least is not growing tobacco, so that you can replenish that soil. Having lots of land under cultivation automatically means that you need lots of people to work that land. Initially, that labor is filled by indentured servants. Now, indentured servants are people from England or Wales or Scotland who, for one reason or another, want to or have to leave their home. But they can't afford to make the journey across the Atlantic. It's very expensive, and it's a very sizable commitment to make that journey at all. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks to travel across the Atlantic. So an indentured servant is somebody that says, okay, if someone will pay for me to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, I agree to give that person X amount of time in labor, right? So I might be in London, and, again, for one reason or another, whether it's debt, whether it is just a lack of opportunity, you name it, I decide that I'm going to leave England, sail across the Atlantic, and live in America, live in Jamestown, or any of the colonies when they're created. There will be agents in London that sort of arrange for this kind of process, arrange for this travel, and I will sign a contract that says I agree to work for 6 years in exchange for the cost of my travel across the Atlantic. In order to help encourage this kind of settlement, the British government and the government of Virginia also established what's called the headright system. The headright system says anyone that pays to bring an indentured servant to Virginia will get an additional 50 acres of land. Now, this land doesn't go to the indentured servant, it goes to the landlord. But it is designed to try to encourage landlords to pay more indentured servant fees to bring more people across the ocean. Now, at the end of my contract as an indentured servant, sometimes I'm just cut loose. Just, thanks a lot, son, you're free to go. Other times, I might be given a lump sum payment, right? Here's the equivalent of, here's the equivalent of $50. Thanks a lot, go to it. Other times I might be given a parcel of land. It varies. Ultimately, though, the indentured servants start to kind of pile up, right? You have more and more of these people who their labor obligations expire, And oftentimes they move away from where the plantations are. The plantations are closer to the Atlantic coast. Indentured servants then move inland, right, where they're under more threat from Native Americans, where they're further removed from the government, where they have less say in political or economic matters, less access to the kind of commerce that's going on in Jamestown or along the coast. And so, because you're constantly having to replenish your indentured servant population, it starts to look a little bit more appealing to have a labor source that doesn't expire, right? That their service to you doesn't just run out in the way that indentured servitude does. This is where slavery will become an appealing option. The first slaves in Jamestown arrive in 1619, but slavery is not a terribly sizable part of the labor population in Jamestown until after the 1670s. And there's an event in 1676 that's known as Bacon's Rebellion, which we'll get to here in a moment. Okay, sorry for the pause there. I had to go avoid a catastrophe. Get it? Catastrophe. Okay, so indentured servitude, very, very popular source of labor, not just in Jamestown, but throughout the colonies, really throughout the 1600s and into the 1700s. But especially in and around the Chesapeake, it starts to lose its appeal, partially because of just the economics, as you have more indentured servants that are putting more of a strain, making more demands of the Virginia government, and also just the cost of constantly bringing new indentured servants into the colony for them only to serve for 5 or 6 or 7 years. That starts to wear on plantation owners who are looking at other options. But slavery doesn't really seem to be the solution until after an event in the summer of 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion happens when a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who was a former indentured servant, manages to kind of make good in the frontier of Virginia, leads a group of other former indentured servants against the Virginia government, the colonial government. Now, partly this is because of economic issues, falling tobacco prices, that indentured servants aren't, or former indentured servants, small farmers, aren't able to absorb in the same way that plantation owners can absorb those falling prices. But Bacon also has personal issues with the governor of Virginia, a man named William Berkeley. And so Bacon gathers followers, many of whom are part of the Virginia militia, and leads them against the capital at Jamestown. He surrounds the capital city, he burns the Capitol building down. This loses virtually any support that he has. People see this and they say, wow, this guy is a madman. We can't allow this to continue. We can't risk bringing more and more indentured servants into the colony if those tensions that Bacon's Rebellion reflects will just get worse and worse. And so it really does point out the class problems of the indentured servant versus plantation population. And it really does make slave labor more appealing, because slaves, one of the great advantages of slavery as an economic system is that enslaved people, by the nature of the system itself, enslaved people have to work for you until you free them or until they die. In addition, slavery is appealing because, especially in the way that slavery exists in the North American colonies, it is self-perpetuating. In other words, the children of enslaved people are enslaved automatically, legally, which means after you purchase the first couple people, any children that they have will be your slaves without you having to pay additional money for more workers. And I know that's disgusting to think about or to say it that way, but we have to think of it in the kinds of economic calculations that people at the time sort of viewed slavery in. And that really was the way that it was viewed, was purely an economic consideration. And from that standpoint, if you remove yourself from the obvious moral and ethical issues involved, economically speaking, there is a lot in favor of slavery. So Bacon's Rebellion really does contribute to a shift in the idea that maybe slavery is the labor system that the Chesapeake region should devote itself to. And ultimately, that's going to be the case. So what's the ultimate payoff here? Well, tobacco, because of the size of the land under cultivation, because of the labor demands that land requires, it makes slavery really the almost inevitable solution here. But it also plays a role in politics, and the reason is you have lots of large plantations, hundreds or thousands of acres, spread out over very large distances. And this makes it virtually impossible to have a democracy, right? Democracy, like we will see in New England, is everybody comes together, they make decisions, and then they go back home. That's virtually impossible because people will have to travel miles and miles in order to have their meeting in a democratic system. So you can't have them constantly traveling back and forth. And so the solution that Virginia comes up with is a representative democracy. It's established in what's called the House of Burgesses in 1619. The House of Burgesses is very similar to what we have today with Congress, right? The United States is not a democracy, technically. The United States is a republic. It is a representative democracy. And essentially what happens is people make a decision to send a particular individual to be their representative, to be their voice in the government. And the plantation system is really the reason that Virginia decides to tackle politics in this way. Because people can't travel miles and miles. Today, it's perfectly simple. You just hop in a car, take a bus, right? Take a subway, whatever your transportation system might be. In the 16 teens, you're either walking or, if you have the money, you're riding a horse. But it takes a while to travel distances. And so if you're traveling, you would have to have somebody operating your homestead or your shop while you're gone. You would have to have some place to stay in town while you're away from your shop or your plantation or your farm. So you have lots of costs involved in trying to participate in the government. And you also have lots of time that you're committing to government service, political service, that otherwise would be put into operating your business. So, unfortunately, only the wealthy are able to participate in the government in Virginia. To some extent, that's the case today too, right? People that participate in government, especially as you get higher and higher from Congress to the Senate to running for president, it requires millions and millions and millions of dollars in order to do that. The average person is not in a position to do those kinds of things in a lot of respects. But Tobacco then plays a dramatic role, not just in providing an economic foundation for Jamestown, which is significant in its own right, but tobacco is also the fundamental reason behind slavery in the United States, ultimately, and tobacco is the fundamental reason why Virginia develops a representative system, a Republican system, and it's not a coincidence that given the influence of Virginians in the early American Republic, especially around the creation of the Constitution, it's not a coincidence that the representative system that is the foundation for Virginia's government is going to be a direct predecessor to the representative system that the United States uses under the Constitution as it's created in 1787. Hugely, hugely significant. So that is where we will pause here. The next sections will probably be shorter than this one. This one ran a little longer than I normally intend. I typically try to shoot for about 20 to 30 minutes for recordings, and so that's sort of my goal in the future. Let me know if you've got questions about anything from the recording. Make sure that you're looking at the PowerPoints on Blackboard as well, so that you're getting all of that material in addition to what we go over in these recordings. So when we come back, we'll talk about a sort of contrasting example of the colonial experience. In this case, we're going to look at New England and see how and why New England develops differently from Virginia, and then what kinds of consequences that difference is going to have going forward through American history. So I will see everybody soon.